Welcome to today's event. This is the second event in the Pay Their Say Their Symposium for this year, and we're focusing on the problem of shaping a global order, the role of small states and multilateral processes in a hegemonic world. This event is a joint effort of the campus and of the Consulate Generals of Norway and Sweden. And it's an enterprise that we've done for a number of years now, with the idea being that we bring Scandinavian scholars together with Berkeley faculty to talk about research problems of common interest, or in the case of today's event, also contemporary problems in world affairs. Perspective that we hope to bring today is to look at this both at the level of international relations. What are the agreements or disagreements about how we should deal with the whole problem of fragile states, failed states, failing states, and also rogue states, but also questions of transformations within these actors, looking in the black box. Our first speaker will be Dr. Anders Melbourn, who is director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs since 1997, and he's a former editor-in-chief of Dagen Nyheter, the leading Swedish newspaper, and he's a regular columnist and commentator on many media in Sweden today. The next talk will be given by Steve Weber, who is a professor of political science at UC Berkeley, and whose most recent book is on open source, and who in the past has written on problems of disarmament and arms control. And our panelists will be in the order that they are seated. And I'll have to look at my colleagues and remember who they are. I mean, I have no excuse. Bob Price is a professor of political science and associate vice chancellor for research, and he's written extensively on South Africa. Next to him is Christian Marius Strijken, who is a researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Studies and has written quite a bit on NATO. And then next to him is Dr. Pavel K. Bav, who is a senior researcher and the head of the Foreign and Security Policies Program at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and he's also head of the working group at the newly created Center for the Study of Civil War at PRIO, and he's written extensively on the Caucasus. And finally, Jerry Saunders from the Peace and Conflicts Studies Department, who's written quite a bit on U.S. foreign policy and on problems of multilateral security and the question of the use of military force under multilateral command.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and after eloquent introductions, you look at your notes and you start thinking, is this of any relevance to what is promised by the moderator? And the only thing then is to dive into your notes, to dive out of them, at least without trying to anyhow stick to what I'm trying to say. I think I have 8 points, but I'm afraid there may be some sub-points, but I hope I will be able to stay within the time frame. My starting point is very simple, and I'm really starting with fundamentals. The American dream is a European dream. If you remember, the United States was created by enterprising Europeans who left for what they thought was a promised land to fulfill a dream that they didn't think that they could fulfill for different reasons in Europe. And of course we have the founding fathers, but then we have the large wave of immigration into the US in the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century, where this of course was very important. I mean, that people wanted to fulfill their European ideas of freedom and of religion, political organization, enterprise, and they felt that they had no hope back home because of poverty and authoritarian society. This was, I think, particularly so in the north. And I think since this is a Swedish-Norwegian venture to a certain extent, I mean, you may allow us to be a little local in that sense. And I mean, we look at the transformation of Swedish society in the 19th century. I mean, we had a very rapid transition from poverty and a rural society to industrialization. And some people stayed, and of the more enterprising people stayed, and they created the labor movement, and what was then later the success of the 20th century of social democracy and welfare democracy in Sweden. And others left for the US and tried to realize these values there. And I mean, the difference, maybe there was a collective version that stayed back home and a more individual version that stayed here, that came here. But still, there were many shared values in this, anti-authoritarian and freedom-oriented values, and also egalitarian values, which I think are, although they took different forms. I mean, I just remind myself and you of that the fact that proportionally more Swedes left for America than any other country except for Ireland. We had 1 million Swedes leaving for America from the mid-19th century, 1850 to 1930 roughly. And that time maybe we had 6 million inhabitants, even less perhaps, but proportional this was very high. And I still think this influences the relationship, that there is some kind of kinship. And I think in the in the Nordic countries, I think I could talk for Norway as well here, there isn't any of the kind of cultural tension that you would have to a certain extent between the French tradition and the Americans, where this aristocratic, slightly condescending view of American popular values I find less of in our part of Europe than perhaps in Central Europe. So I think this is my starting point as a Scandinavian looking at this, that there is this basic kinship, which sometimes I think is overlooked. And with this starting point, it's perhaps easy also to look into a little, this gives a certain demographic perspective to this. And one aspect for the future that we may perhaps consider a little, and especially being in California, that if the American dream originally is a European dream, is the United States getting demographically less European. And of course it is. And it's primarily so in this state of California. When I learned last time I was here, which was August of 2000, it was reported in that very month that California for the first time had a non-European, you could perhaps say, if you don't use perhaps more dangerous terms, a non-white majority of Asians, of Latinos, but also, of course, of Afro-Americans. And this is, of course, and this is the part of the American continent where you look westwards towards Asia. We know, what is it, that 40% of the freshman class at Berkeley is Asian in origin in some different ways. Will this influence in one way? I mean, this is an early question, perhaps, that some of the Berkeley colleagues could take up. Will this influence America in the long run? We know a little that Asia seems to be more interested in enterprise than politics, yet we have seen very little of this, of a strong Asian influence on ethnic Asian politics in the US, as far as I know, but it would be interesting to hear what you say about it. And I mean, because would that mean then that the political aspects would be less important in American decision making? Let's say that the universalist interest would be less. You know, we know that, of course, the present president had a pretty isolationist agenda in the election campaign of 2000. Then it turned out very different for reasons that we may come back to. Another aspect of this would say is Europe also will Europe the next years be less globally oriented? I'm not so sure, but we may remind ourselves that on May 1st we will have 10 more members of the European Union. There will be, which is a very fascinating transformation of the European polity, which I think is extremely important and of also great relevance for the discussion we will have here about how you try to democratize the world. I mean, the European model of enlargement may be something we could come back to. But of course, this will mean that Europe or the and of course, when we talk Europe, we usually mean the European Union. I'm sorry to say that we don't have our Norwegian friends formally in there, but I mean but I include Norway anyhow in some way in this. But with this inward-looking period of the EU with a new constitution coming up, well, we don't know. Well, the British decision today about the referendum, what effect that will have. But Europe will look at so many internal things that this may prevent it from looking abroad and more globally. I'm not so sure, but it could be mentioned as a risk of this. But I mean, because another aspect of this enlarged European Union is, of course, that in the next phase we will probably start negotiations with the Turks. We hope for that decision, many of us at least, in December. And the result of that could be in 10 years' time that when you look at the near neighborhood of Europe, there will be countries like Iraq and Syria that will be direct neighbors of the EU. And of course, we'll come to that theme later. Maybe we'll finally meet then in Iraq in 10 years' time if it doesn't happen before that. But of course, it means that this is a extremely relevant area for Europe, also for very selfish reasons, because it's going to be a neighboring area. But my basic feeling is that with all the quarrels and all the discussions and the policy differences and the discussions going on now about the European defense and security policy, NATO and EU hard security aspects, and I'm sure Christian will talk about some of that later here. We are basically, by the outside world, by the rest of the world, seen as the rich West together. We, in Europe and in the US, have this certain universalistic tendency. We have some kind of value projection tendency of thinking that we have something to offer to the world, and I mean that could be also put in more conflictful terms. But regardless of these differences, and even if these differences between the Europe and the United States is structural in the way that Professor Krasner talked about last night, and I think he was partly right in that, even with these differences, and even if they are structural, I think we are in this together and have to find a ways of coping with many of these problems together, because that's the way the outside world will perceive us. I mean, if terrorist activity and the warlike dimensions that terrorism took on 9/11 constitute the new security threat to the industrial world, then we share it. We are part of it. I would perhaps even say, and this is one of my favorite points, although I find it very problematic, is that what happened on September 11, 2001 could be seen as an attack on the more globalized Western appearance of the 1990s. If you talk it in American administration terms, I think the 9/11 was directed towards Clinton's America, the benign hegemon, the benign only superpower, open to cooperation with others, of course on top and perhaps gaining more than others. But it was this open system that was increasingly, with its remaining cleavages and all that, but with its increasing universalist attraction, that was attacked. And in one way, if you look once again at the Bush agenda in the election 2000, that was a more narrow agenda. Then, of course, it turned around because of 9/11. So, I mean, I think that there is a symbolism in this, that we are in this together, and even if we get more than Western cooperation, it may be more dangerous for attacks in the short run. But at least if we cope with it in the way that we think about it, would like to do, it would be, of course, certain risks, but at the same time, I think it's inevitable. So I think the real conflict between the US and Europe today lies in how you perceive the threat and how do you want to deal with it. And of course, that was obvious in the discussion last night. I could maybe still reiterate perhaps some points in my own language on the way I preferred it. I mean, why many of us in Europe, I think the majority in Europe, if I say Europe, I know that this is what I think is a majority opinion. I know that there are different opinions, but I think we know that if this is a war, and maybe we don't like the concept of war in this sense, but if we use the word war, it's a war against non-state actors with obscure tactics. And to meet that, or to take part in that war, you cannot only use military means, perhaps not even primarily military means, even if you use the war analogy, which may be correct in the sense that the attacks on 9/11 were of a more warlike proportion. And we may say that Europeans as yet have underestimated the need for military potential in this, but at the same time, the American side has definitely underestimated the need for other means of meeting this. And a side comment perhaps here is, of course, saying that even with this tremendous military domination that the US has, which was also emphasized last night, you could say today you see that the United States cannot really deal with the situation in Iraq. You need more ground troops. You have problems finding ground troops for this. You are forced to have 20,000 troops now staying 3 extra months. That you haven't got the capacity for recirculation. And we are talking about this dominating military power which we say we have never seen in the world before. And it hasn't got the men and the money to pursue this conflict in Iraq, regardless of how you value it, whether you think it's justifiable. Of course, this then relates to my second point here, that a terror campaign could easily be very overstretched, and it lacks exit strategy. By the way, isn't that Colin Powell language, really, when it comes to military strategy, rather than European language? But it's one of the problems, I think, when you talk about a war on terrorism. Because terrorism, of course, it's a means, it's a tactic, it's not an ideological adversary like we had in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And of course, in a war like this, it's very dangerous that confuse it with an old agenda that you may have and have it encompass everything. And I think this is, of course, the single most dramatic point at this moment. But I can't see this as a structural difference between America and Europe as such. But of course, at this very moment, it's, of course, the war in Iraq, where it's very hard for a majority of Europeans, I'm not talking about all Europeans, because who knows Europeans, to see that this is part of the same struggle, while that the Iraqi issue, which was a problem, was brought into the war on terrorism, but was originally something very different. It was a problem with weapons of mass destruction, which at least had been a problem with that. It was an abusive state. We know that especially in the 1980s, when it was supported by the US and many in Europe, because of the power play at that time with Iran, I mean, this abusiveness was also most manifest when weapons of mass destruction were used, etc. But as I see it, I mean, the Saddam Hussein regime, which was a problem, but it was contained since several years back, and with quite a lot of suffering for ordinary people and things like that. It was not even a sovereign state. It had very limited sovereignty in one way, with the sanctions, with the free fly zones, with the oil for food program and all those kinds of things, and the inspections, of course. And I think if Iraq is a failed state today, which I think it is, it was made a failed state by the war, not before it was an abusive state, but it was not a failed state, if we should go back to that And this, of course, brings me to my second last point. I don't know where I am, Mr. Chairman, in my time. And this is, of course, a rather improper point, being a visitor in another country. You shouldn't get involved in domestic politics in that country. But I think, even for the sake of analysis here, I think if we are going to re-establish the European-US relationship at this very time, it requires some kind of change of administration in the United States. We know now that there is an interest of getting the UN into Iraq in some way, or getting NATO or EU or the Europeans in general. But to me, it seems impossible. And I think, to begin with, I think that this is Iraq as it now is, the failed state as it now is, with the terrorist activity which it is now open to, etc., etc. This is a security concern for us in Europe. But it's very hard to be invited in to share the defeat, not even being part of the victory, if there was a victory a year ago. And it's also hard to be, and now I know I use very nasty language, to be, if to be invited by the responsible perpetrator for this. I'm not using the word culprit. But I mean, and I think in order to get something joined together, it has to be done with another American administration. I think it could be done. If it will be successful, I mean, that's another story. I'm going back to what I said about seeing the joint West. Maybe it would be even more dangerous. I mean, when we saw the attack last August on the UN mission, and which brought the tragic death of Sergio Vieira de Mello, of course, we saw that this effort of making the occupation slightly more benign with the UN participation was, of course, immediately on May the aim to get at from the opponents of this. So, but I feel that I have to make this point. But as I said, Europe, I think, will be in. This is a concern for us. Once again, it will be our immediate neighbor. And I think the enlargement model also offers some of the attractions on how to build democracies that should be interesting also from the US perspective. My final point then is going back to where I started. I think the North could be particularly interesting in trying to re-establish a transatlantic link. And maybe all parts of Europe say that, but okay, now you get my version of it from my perspective. I think we have perhaps not the military potential traditionally, maybe we are overlooking that fact as well, but I mean there are other attractions and interesting aspects in the North for the transatlantic relationship. The first point is the natural Atlanticist orientation, which I mentioned in the introduction, going back to this demographic kind of relationship we have. The other thing is that it's a very interesting region the coming years, because it will be a mix of aligned nations and old non-aligned nations like Sweden, old aligned nations like Norway, new aligned nations like the Baltic states and Poland. I'm now, I don't know whether I should use the old new Europe language, which we all use, although we don't like the context in which it was presented. But I mean, you have all of that in the northern region. You have Germany, the old European US friend, which turned something else. I don't know whether they really did, but okay, that's another discussion. You have Poland, you have the Baltic states, we have we have the old footnote Denmark, which is now a Bush activist in Europe, and we have Norway with its, and we have Sweden. It's an interesting mix, but they all feel a certain link, an interest in keeping the transatlantic link, perhaps more so than in other parts of Europe. One of them being, of course, our closeness to Russia. And I mean, we don't now perceive or foresee a military attack from Russia, but still there is certain unease about this. We are very interested in the democratization of Russia, of course, because it's in our interest. But we do not really trust Paris for security there. I mean, we would like to have the Americans in the region in some way. Another point, more perhaps important, is that we can show certain successful precedents of peaceful conflict prevention. enlargement to the Baltic of the European Union. And of course we have the which is, I think, it's a very interesting case that should be talked. You should have more comparative study of what happened in the Balkans after 1991 and what happened in the Baltic states, and why did we have this very successful development in the Baltic states. Can come back to that. Then of course we have the 1905 experience together with the Norwegians, and the peaceful way we settled that, and we will celebrate that next year. And we talked at lunch about making some kind of event here in the Bay Area in the fall of 2005, where we can link up to that. Then we should, of course, finally mention that we have this historic commitment to a broad security agenda. Ambassador Cherie was talking about that, although you didn't use exactly that term yet last night. But I think that's, and it's very important. I mean, there is development aid in this, there is multilateralism in this, but there is also the very strong free trade orientation and the commitment to free trade also on the political left that you have in the in Northern Europe, which is, I think, important in this sense. And finally, then we have in this also a pool of competence and initiatives that we have had during the years for peaceful solutions, new kind of alignments and things like that, mediation, all these aspects that we link to the Scandinavian contribution in the last decades. And then my final sentence will be, I mean, at the moment I must admit, unfortunately, as the Swedes say, that I find much more of this activity from the Norwegian side. And even with Norway, the NATO member, I think is more involved in mediation, peace-building efforts than non-aligned Sweden is. And maybe that's a very interesting lesson for us to draw that. And that is, of course, then my final remark, leaving it off from there. Thank you very much.
No, I can speak from here. That's okay. Well, I should tell you that we're actively thinking about inviting certain foreigners to vote in our elections this year. So, if you're interested,
but not in this state. It wouldn't be necessary here.
Well, you know, Florida.
We have to find Missouri or Florida for us in that sense.
Okay, I want to pick up on some of the things that Anders said and frame a kind of focal question about the question about failed states or rogue states a little bit differently. And I want to do it in a way that I think is interesting and probably achievable, is to say, how can we conceptualize this problem and talk about it in a way, or say talk about a set of management strategies that create some kind of common foundation for productive dialogue between Europe and the United States, which I think we really don't have right now in a significant way. And let me then lay bare a kind of preconception on this. I do not actually think it's inevitable, and I'm not even going to say it's necessarily desirable, that the United States and Europe, per se, agree on either the nature of the problem or the nature of the solution. Maybe we need to disagree about it and run parallel but quite significantly different experiments in different parts of the world so that we can learn more over time about what works and what does not work. Certainly, spitting at each other over issues is not a good thing for anyone, but I want to at least acknowledge up front that a kind of deep consensus might not be what we need to aim for. Maybe what we need to aim for is a kind of respectful dissensus and competing policies. So having said that, let me put, rather than 8, just actually 3 propositions on the table for discussion. And they're a little different. So proposition 1 is that failed states are actually not a major strategic problem for either the United States or Europe. That failed states are a humanitarian problem. And that the strategic and security problem that we need to worry about actually lies not in failed states, but in weak states that function well enough that they connect effectively to the global political economy and thus make themselves very attractive and effective allies for transnational criminal and terrorist organizations. Proposition 2 says that the good thing about Proposition 1, apart from the fact that it's true, is that it makes possible actually a relatively minimalist, high-level foreign policy doctrine for the United States. And I think that's important because I think we need minimalism to build a sustainable platform for American domestic politics in this area, and I think we need minimalism to build a sustainable platform for the US and Europe to agree on at least some things that really matter. Proposition 3 is that if we get that sort of core minimalist stuff from Proposition 2 right, then it opens up a space for people to experiment with the really hard and complex problems of failed states. And because the stakes in that game are lower and the time frame for action is longer, then you can imagine a kind of market-style, friendly but intense competition between US ideas and European ideas, and that this would be a very good thing because it would likely accelerate the process by which both of us might get better at this, and then we might actually be better at helping the people who live in these places. So let me spend a couple of minutes fleshing out each of those propositions and try to convince you that they kind of make sense together. So first, what do I think is the real nature of the threat environment that both of us face? And I agree with you, we share that threat environment in a really profound and simple way. If you go to, the sexy thing in Washington now is to talk about the security risk from failed states, and usually the images that get brought up are the sort of Sudans and Ethiopias of the world. So when I give talks about this in DC, I block this by showing two slides right next to each other. Neither of them has anything to do with Sudan or Ethiopia. The first slide comes from the CIA Annual Fact Book, which is available on the web. It's a set of arrows that show the global flows of the gray economy. Cocaine and heroin, illegal migrants, trafficking in women and children, and stolen autos. If there was room on the slide for another arrow, there would be plutonium and highly enriched uranium. But the arrows, the important thing is the arrows overlap, and they would still overlap. And the critical thing you see right away is that those arrows, those flows, do not travel significantly through what we think of as failed states. Why? Because those states don't have reliable institutional infrastructure that the gray global economy needs to keep it running efficiently. I mean, this is a high-tech economy we're talking about here. It runs on ultra-modern networks. It uses the cutting edge of technologies to facilitate transactions, and it's big, right? So if you look at the numbers, and these are, again, US government estimates, so they're probably underestimates, $300 billion a year in narcotics, $15 billion a year trafficking in toxic and hazardous wastes, $10 billion in automobile theft, $8 or $9 billion in alien smuggling. Now, just to give you a sense of the kind of magnitude of those numbers relative to the political furor that gets built up here in the United States over things like Napster and the illegal downloading of copyrighted music, the US music industry is $11 billion annually. All right. So what I'm saying is the gray economy, this gray economy, the one I'm talking about, is a very, and I'm not talking about downloading music, a very elaborate and very profitable business network. But it's not some kind of scale-free ethereal network. It has nodes, like many networks do. And you see it on the map. Those nodes are not in failed states. Where are they? They're in parts of the United States, but most importantly, they are in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Nigeria, Ukraine, other parts of Eastern Europe, Russia, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Malaysia. None of those are failed states. They're weak states. They're states that are functioning sufficiently well to remain tied into the financial and logistical infrastructure of the global economy. So the second slide that I put up next to that is not a picture of decrepit villages in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's a superimposition of a picture of Tony Soprano and Vladimir Putin. Right? Because to me, this is, and if our friends from Northern Europe haven't heard of Tony Soprano, I can explain later.
No.
That's where the real strategic
That's
risk.
the cultural affinity.
Yeah, no, good. Well, I'm glad to see that you.
Globalization.
We all agree about Northern New Jersey. That's what matters.
Yeah.
This is where the real strategic risk lies, in my mind, in this nexus between weak states and transnational criminal organizations. The key lesson of Afghanistan, as I see it, when we invaded, we found out when we invaded, was that it was not as it was not as failed a state as we thought it was. It was a weak state with a moderately functioning infrastructure that was owned by a rather tight coalition between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda drew a kind of, access to the global economy as well as a funny kind of legitimacy from its intertwining with the Taliban state structure. It was a symbiotic, synergistic relationship which creates a new reality that's more important than failed states. Shadow states pursuing subterranean policies of disruption through their functioning connections to global flows. The good news in that story was that Afghanistan was relatively small. Some of these states could be large. And so maybe it sounds a little bit ironic in the post-Cold War world, but let's go back and talk about Russia again, or Indonesia, or Pakistan. What do these countries have in common? People say when one hand gets tied behind your back, the other hand gets very limber. In all of those cases, you have the gradual subversion of formal institutions and the substitution of a set of informal institutions that are controlled to some degree by the state and to some degree by transnational criminal organizations. Think about, Pakistan's proliferation network, which we're now learning quite a lot about, as the exemplar of this. And the problem is those groups potentially have a very strongly shared interest, and that is precisely in opposing U.S. power. And that's our problem. So imagine, it's 2007, and Vladimir Putin and Boris Berezovsky, who's kind of his Tony Soprano, are sitting in the Kremlin, and they agree together that, the U.S. is just getting a little too strong for its own good, in two ways that are significant to each of them. The combination of anti-ballistic missile deployments that trouble the Russian military, and the effective location-based surveillance measures at U.S. ports that make it harder to move Russian drugs into Brighton Beach. And that's a little bit too much for this coalition to deal with. So there's an obvious solution. Right? Berezovsky introduces Putin to his cousin Pasha, who used to work for the KGB, but now works for some other organization. And Pasha can help us. He has very close ties to his friends at the port of Newark, where it's relatively easy to creatively lose a little bit of nuclear material. And after all, Putin knows that everyone else knows that his government can't quite control this stuff. So who is really to blame if some of it ends up in a container that blows up in New York Harbor? My point is that these guys believe they have nothing to lose from this and much to gain from doing it, but most importantly, that they could do it. And they could do it much more easily than anything has to travel through Sudan or Ethiopia. So that's the real strategic risk, in my mind. Proposition 2. That's an easier problem to deal with at a high level than the political and economic miasma of truly failed states. Right? I think it's important just to kind of think about that in the context of one of the key lessons we learned from the Cold War and containment. Containment, in a fundamental sense, was actually a kind of limited strategy. Didn't always play out that way, but at least in its core ideological justification, the idea that Kennan borrowed from Walter Lippmann, who borrowed it from Nicholas Spikeman, was that the U.S. really only needed to ensure that of the 4 or 5 big centers of power in the world, we would never find ourselves in a situation where all the rest were combined against us. And this, of course, is why Kennan was a big supporter of early efforts at European integration. It was also why he was an early opponent of NATO. He wanted the Europeans to be their own independent center of power, autonomous from the United States. He didn't want the Europeans to fall into a culture of security dependence on the Americans, and he believed that an independently powerful Europe would, on more than occasional basis, act as a kind of restraint on Americans who might get a little too ambitious in their goals for world order. It didn't always play out exactly that way. And containment was, in practice, not as minimalist a strategy as Lippmann and the early Kennan would have liked. But it was minimalist enough, I think, that it held together the transatlantic alliance through thick and thin. Not to say, of course, it was smooth sailing. I used to tell people in 1989 and 90, when people talked about the crisis of NATO, I don't know if this is actually true, but I said it loudly enough that people believed it, that every book written about NATO since 1955 had the word crisis in the title. If not everyone did, most of them did. It worked well enough, okay, to hold the center together. And we did actually together win the Cold War, in part because of that persistence. My point simply is that it would have been much more difficult to do that in the context of a more demanding or more ambitious foreign policy doctrine. Robert Kaplan may be, a little bit over-embellished, but the U.S. and Western Europe really do view the world in different ways, and there's plenty we don't agree about. So just, without indulging in that, consider the counterfactual. If U.S. leaders had believed during the Cold War that security depended on the success of rapid and aggressive efforts to change the domestic politics of the Soviet Union, or had depended on the victory of the Kuomintang in the Chinese Civil War, or if we had not eventually been willing to walk away from the failed efforts of Vietnam, how much harder would it have been to sustain the transatlantic partnership during the Cold War? I think it was this relative minimalism of the core elements of containment that kept us on the same basic page for 45 years. I don't think that's a pessimistic assessment. I think it's an honest one, and I think, it was a huge achievement with lots of great spin-off effects, which is why I think we need a similarly minimalist foreign policy doctrine for the next decade and need to articulate it rather soon. A U.S. foreign policy doctrine built around trying to aggressively deal with failed states, whether it's, by preemption or by nation building or whatever you want to say, is not it. It's too ambitious for the United States to start. I mean, the cost of maintaining this kind of strategy could easily reach 7 or 8% of GDP, and I'd be willing to defend the sub-proposition that we will not stick with it through more than one presidential election, if that. But would instead end up in a kind of Buchanan-style isolationism that would see the United States pull back from the world behind a high-tech defense perimeter and make Washington, not Seattle, the primary home of the next, neo-anti-globalization movement. And that won't be a good thing for the rest of the world, and it will not be a good thing for Europe, because Europe will then have to face by itself the renationalization of defense policies around the region, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction on its own borders, and the Finlandization of Asia as small countries orient toward China. So the alternative, and the one I'm sort of putting out on the table today for discussion, it might sound ironically like a kind of pre-post-Cold War focus on the security threat from large and important states. That sounds very 1980s. But I think it makes sense. Large would still mean large. Important would now mean weakly consolidated democracy rather than communist government. And the differentiating feature between those that pose a threat and those that don't are the large and weakly consolidated states that have demonstrably close relationships with the gray underground global economy of terrorist and criminal networks. In other words, I'm saying more, not less attention to Russia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Syria, perhaps Saudi Arabia, maybe in the not-so-distant future, unfortunately, a post-occupation Iraq. I hope we don't have to have that conversation, but maybe we do. And then finally, just to finish up, that might be a more manageable and contained agenda. It might be one that US and Europe can agree on at least part of the time. And so if we could get to that place and sustain a reasonable level of collaboration on those core security issues, then I'd like to see us sort of use that platform to open the door for more aggressively competitive foreign policy strategies around failed states. Sudan's a humanitarian tragedy. It's happening before our eyes. The HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa is worse than a tragedy. And while I spent most of the time talking about my view that neither of those things pose the same kind of strategic threat we would face from, say, the Colombianization of Mexico, those issues and the kinds of failed state issues they represent are very serious issues for people who care not only about national security narrowly defined, but people who care about the value of human lives. And that's all of us. But it's also the case that we have very little real positive experience in managing those subcritical issues. So anybody who tells you that they know how to deal with these kinds of issues is trying to short circuit what I think is going to be at best a process of trial and error. There are plenty of proposals out. Bush administration believes in the Millennium Challenge account goals, even if it hasn't really put up any resources to support the strategy behind it. The World Bank believes in building infrastructure. The Markle Foundation believes in information and communications technology. The Gates Foundation believes in curing malaria. Hernando de Soto believes in the establishment of land titles. There's a lot of ideas on the table. I believe we should be experimenting with all of these ideas, and probably some more besides. But I believe also that if we're going to move forward and do that effectively and learn through the kind of trial and error that I believe we need to have two things in place. A successful high-level security policy, maybe like the one I've suggested, and an agreement on the fundamental goals and basic tactics of that strategy between the United States, the European Union, and its associated countries, and, by the way, very soon, if not already today, China as well. So my ending point would be to say, if I put on the table something in a rudimentary form, if it developed further and had at least a 50-50 chance of meeting those criteria, I would say that's pretty good odds for foreign policy development. Thanks. Steve.
I'm next. I'm trying, as I sit here, to think about how to cut into this discussion using my my knowledge of the South African experience of democratization to say something relevant to this discussion. And let me do it. Let me try this out. Let me see if I'm going to comment on the feasibility of the currently fashionable answer or response to the threat of terrorism, at least currently fashionable in our government, which I think was referred to actually by Anders Milburn earlier as the European US, in this case, let's say US project of global democratization. The failed states, the weak states, ultimately the way to deal with the problems, whether it's international crime or international terrorism, is ultimately to make them stable democracies, and the project of US foreign policy, if we listen to the Bush administration, is to bring that about. And what does South Africa tell us? The South African experience tell us about this, and I just would add parenthetically that South Africa is often presented as the model that can be emulated by weak and failed states. Ironically, because South Africa was such a surprise, I think. Nobody expected South Africa to have such a consolidated, peaceful, and unchallenged democracy after apartheid. Turned out that it has, and now it is turns out to be on everybody's mind as a model. Well, I want to suggest to you that actually, if we look seriously at the South African case, it's not a model for any place else in the world, that there are certain exceptional and special qualities which are directly related to the success of the South African experience. And so looking at South Africa, we may actually be able to raise some questions about whether this global democratization agenda is at all feasible. So let me, since I only have a couple of minutes, without really defending these propositions or these statements, let me suggest 3 or 4 special qualities of the South African experience and of South Africa, which I will assert are crucial to the success that South Africa has had in creating a democratic order for which there is within South Africa, to which there's no significant opposition or challenge to either the principles, the institutions of democracy, or the principles upon which parliamentary democracy in South Africa exists. There is no significant political critique of these or challenge to these in the last 10 years. Let me suggest that there are certain qualities in South Africa which one is unlikely to find in any of these states that one could call weak or failed or whatever in the rest of the world. So let me just run through 4 of them very briefly. First, South Africa is a society that had been undergoing the twin processes of industrialization and modernization since the last third of the 19th century, roughly the same time period that one would date the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution or the German Industrial Revolution, a little slower in South Africa, but it dates back to that period. What is the significance of this for the project of democratization? I would suggest to you that that process, that twin process, created a large permanent urban population with few active ties to rural village-based clan and kinship structures, which are, in many parts of the world, the sinews of ethnic and sectarian political tension. And while these things were being attenuated under the process of South African industrialization and modernization, other types of identities were being forged, identities with class and nation. And this has dampened down and reduced the level of ethnic tension, of tribal tension, if you like, that many observers prior to 1994 expected to dominate South African politics. Secondly, South Africa has a deep and vibrant civil society. It has a free and independent press, which survived the era of apartheid, and indeed became more assertive and more independent in the last decade of the apartheid era during the period of the liberation struggle. It has the entire plethora of functional associations, trade unions, professional associations, student groups, women's associations, all well organized and active in the body politic. And thirdly, it has a broad foundation of grassroots community organizations, which had many of which had their birth in the period of the liberation struggle in the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s. Thirdly, and this perhaps may surprise you, but South Africa's transition was really not a transition to democracy. South Africa had been a parliamentary democracy since 1910. People don't think of apartheid South Africa that way, but South Africa, from the time of union in 1910, had democratic parliamentary institutions. Certainly, these were institutions for a racial minority. They excluded the majority of the population. But the existence of these democratic institutions resulted in the institutionalization, I would argue, that's what I have to think about, of democracy in South Africa long before 1994 and the first non-racial election. I would ask you to think about the South African situation as analogous to English democratization. Right? In 1832, the Reform Act of 1832, a milestone of parliamentary democracy, so the textbooks would tell us in England, 5% of the English, less than 5% of the English population was given the franchise. It wasn't until 40 to 50 years later that the majority of the British working class entered the democratic political system. And many people argue that it is this process of the late involvement of the majority of the population which is a key to the stability of English democratization, that the institutionalization of democratic values and institutions occurred prior to the involvement of the inclusion of the majority of the population in a democratic order. And I would suggest to you that South Africa has, in essence, gone through the same process, although the exclusion in South Africa was based on race, not class, but the analogy, I think, holds. And then finally, in an odd sort of way, South Africa has a political history which emphasizes the rule of law, and that has been true even during the period of white supremacy and apartheid. I mean, one of the bizarre aspects of the apartheid regime was the intense attention that was given to making all of the, to codifying legally all of the discriminatory laws that were imposed on society. And so from the Afrikaner side, you have a long history of operating and almost being obsessed by response to and the authority of the law. And ironically, you can find the same thing on the side of the black population in the liberation struggle, which actually never gave up in trying to beat the apartheid regime in its own courts. They never succeeded in doing that, but despite, you might say, the objective reality, you have a history of where even the opponents and those were disadvantaged, grossly disadvantaged by the apartheid regime, relied upon the legal system. And I think this is also a part of the South African inheritance and helps us understand, for example, why there has been so little extra-parliamentary, extra-legal efforts on the part of the white minority to overthrow and to undermine the democratic order. Most people in 1994 expected a major effort on the part of elements of the white right in South Africa to do in the new democratic order. And the analogies were made to the OAS in Algeria. Well, this has not happened. In a stunning way, it hasn't happened. And I wanted to suggest to you just now, and all I say that I have much time, is one ought to think about, and I think it's important, we don't have the research on this, but one hypothesis is the reason there's been so little of this is that the Afrikaner population in South Africa, from whom one expected these kinds of responses, obeys legal authority. And they have a long, you might say, historical and cultural tradition of doing so. Let me leave it.
Thank you. I would like to turn to certain specific issues in EU-US security relations. And I take as a basic starting point that I do agree to what Anders just said regarding the basic kindship between Europeans and Americans. But how come we are in this situation so much characterized by crisis? It's true, like we heard on the other major introduction, that there has always been crisis in transatlantic relations. But this time, I think we can tell from the debate and from what we can read in the newspapers every day that the crisis is much more deep. And what used to be called the West is no more probably to be called the coalition of the unwilling. And if we think that's a problem, we should start addressing how to make the unwilling states, which we have seen somehow fighting each other diplomatically the last year, trying to reach some kind of accommodation. And I was really struck when I was on the plane flying here how different transatlantic security relations look these days as compared to in the mid-1990s. As you all will recall, the mid-1990s was really characterized by great uncertainty, in the sense that the end of the Cold War made everyone, and specifically people working on security issues, thinking, so what's next? But what I came to on the plane is that even though there was so much uncertainty at that time, well, what was NATO doing, and what was the Europeans and the Americans doing together? Basically, well, there were joint efforts in the Balkans, even though there were differences, and severe differences for sure. NATO enlargement was on track. At least it came on track by the mid-1990s. NATO was developing its relations to Russia. And despite differences, I would say, if you asked yourself or if you asked anyone in, let's say, 1995, so do you think you can tell where transatlantic relations will be in 5 years? I think most people would say, yes, I think the alliance is doing pretty fine. There's a direction to what we are doing, and it seems like we are heading most of the time in the same direction. Today, I see very few people actually daring to ask the question, so where do you think transatlantic security relations will be in 5 years? Everyone seems to be so obsessed about, well, blaming each other, trying to avoid the question, but it's really time to ask the question, so where do you think transatlantic security relations will be in 5 years' time? And I'm afraid I can't give you the answer, but I'm posing the question just to sort of put it in a little bit of perspective to make sure that the challenges that I would like to raise is at least some of the questions that are central to finding the solution, along with the questions you already had mentioned in your interventions. Because at the present time, I see so little common strategic thinking in the EU and in the US, which make me think, well, if there are anything we can do without sort of addressing the major questions. Let's see if that's a feasible way as well. And in that sense, I think it's important to ask the question, to what extent will the US look favorably and positively on European security integration in the years to come? As you probably know, during the 1990s, the US was somewhat concerned, but largely supportive to see a greater European security identity developing. Today, the emphasis seems more to be on trying to express outright opposition, or to find the strategy of rule and divide, old and new Europe. To my mind, that's a very bad strategy. And it's a bad strategy for the basic fact that Europeans would ask themselves, what can we do to influence US foreign policy? Is there anything we can do to influence US foreign policy? And they will listen quite carefully when Bush is talking to Tony Blair, because Tony Blair, supposedly, he has some kind of influence on US foreign policy. Okay, you may argue against my argument, and that's basically my argument as well. Because what is Tony Blair doing? Well, he is greeted by George Bush to be, and I'm trying to make this quote right, Tony is a stand-up kind of guy. And sure, that's something that Bush obviously admires, not surprisingly. But however, the thing is, most Europeans perceive Tony Blair to be a poodle. And even though I would argue, well, he has had some influence, we should ask ourselves, what is sort of the political basis for having Europeans becoming the stand-up kind of poodles for the US? Well, basically, there is no reason to believe that that's going to be the case whatsoever. Because in Europe, as in the US, foreign policy has to have some public approval. And even though I don't have all the numbers with me at the moment, it's a basic fact that, well, many Europeans think that George Bush is a greater threat to international peace than international terrorism. I'm not saying that I'm agreeing, but I'm saying that's a basic fact of European politics, which might be changed. But it will not be changed unless something very strange and very surprising will happen in the years to come, and there will be a substantial shift of emphasis in the US and in Europe. I'm trying to round this up by saying a few words on what the US challenge is and what is the European challenge. Well, basically, the US should make up its mind on would the US like to have what Henry Kissinger was calling for in 1973, a European telephone number that he can call. The President can give a call to the European Union. Well, for sure, I'm the first to admit there will be not only one operator on the line at any given time, not in the foreseeable future. But I think the US should make up its mind on what is most conducive to US foreign policy. To call individual governments most of the time, or to call the European Union most of the time. And this is very much a soul-searching exercise. So to the Europeans, I would say, and that includes Norwegians, even though we're not members of the EU, the European Union has to get its act together, which means developing military, economic, and political capabilities to match its global political ambitions, and basically to be taken more seriously in the US. Because without greater capabilities, I would not be surprised to see the European Union being ignored for years to come in Washington. So is there a way forward? Just one sec. Well, I'm not going to interfere in US presidential elections, but I would like to say that it would be very helpful, at least, to have some kind of regime change in the US. And I'm not saying that because I'm under the illusion that US foreign policy will fundamentally change as a consequence of Kerry becoming the president, but basically because that would at least initiate a fundamental change of atmosphere, which is required to enhance transatlantic security relations. And that's the best thing we can hope for, I suppose. And given that fact, I very much agree to Steve. We need to get back to a minimalist agenda. No more global adventures, at least not in military terms. That will make the transatlantic alliance fall apart to the extent it's not already has been falling apart. And I would like to suggest one thing, which I think might be quite useful to explore. And that is a transatlantic homeland security strategy. That's a pretty defensive rather than offensive strategy. It's something that can be pursued quite pragmatically, basically by thinking ahead on how can we prevent and protect ourselves from being targeted by terrorists. And to my mind, that reminds me of Article 5, NATO's Article 5, which was the minimalist clue of the alliance for many years. And I think that's where we should start. And I hope you will like to engage in that discussion for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Unlike one commentator yesterday, I really find it difficult to disagree with the speakers of today. On the other hand, you don't travel all the way from Oslo to here to agree with other people's bright ideas. And that 11-hour flight that I'm going to take later today, it really creates a burning desire to challenge some conventional wisdoms, at least relying on your jet lag with the absence of other capacities. So thinking about how to frame my disagreements, I stumbled over one fairly obvious observation. Yes, there is a gap, discrepancy between how United States and Europe perceive those security challenges and humanitarian catastrophes that we call failed states just for convenience. There is this discrepancy, but it's not as big and as yawning as might have been expected. So both the gap and its shallowness require explanation. And I will not be able to build for you a comprehensive argument. I will just throw 2 points in the footnote for explaining the difference, and 2 points for explaining its smallness of this difference, and expect that this will carry me through the half an hour I have at my disposal. And,
It's only 10 minutes.
and the lack of response from the chair is really encouraging.
But
So-
fortunately, panelists.
So my first point is that at least some of these discrepancies might be explained from the fact that Europe has vast and first-hand experience with state failure, and fairly recent. Most of the senior European citizens have this experience of how their state failed them. And it's not only the war which is a question. I think it's important to remember how many local variations of Nazism and fascism there were in Europe and how politically successful they were. And it's not just the past experiences. State failure in Europe continues as we speak. It's ongoing process. And not in some faraway regions inside Europe. So in this sense, Europeans have kind of understanding that no one is immune from that. No state is too big not to fail. The Soviet Union was as big as it gets. And no state is too small. Look at this tiny Moldova and how it continuously fails. So Europeans probably are much more able to internalize the problem, really to feel it from inside. When they're speaking about failed states, they're not speaking first of all about Rwanda. They think about Kosovo. And when they're thinking further, they're not thinking Black Hawk Down. They're thinking Srebrenica. It's all inside. It's all first-hand experience. And second point here would be that thinking about what is the main driving force for state failure. There might be differences here as well. And the easiest answer on which is easiest to agree, and it was given yesterday when I say poverty. And generally there is this complex of richness, that kind of guilt complex of being too rich. You're saying poverty, and we're all saying, yes, sure, poverty. At the same time, experience Europe has points against that. Yugoslavia wasn't really a starving state. And in the former Soviet Union, Georgia was one of the richest, one of the most affluent parts, and they both failed and continue to fail pretty miserably. So when we're going to try to find other explanations other than poverty, in the United States quite often you hear dictatorship, essentially mismanagement. But in Europe, thinking might go in a different way. I think the key word here is secessionism, because for Europe that is a huge political problem. And not just how many secessionist conflicts there are there. It's important to remember that many, if not most, European states are products of secessionist projects, including Norway, for that matter. So it is a very delicate topic, which brings in all sorts of kind of issues from the past and from the present, and that's why Europeans have really no clue what to do with Kosovo. Not a beginning of idea how to deal with this issue, because it's involved this thing about secessionism. Essentially, all the difficult issues are postponed, as they were postponed in the Oslo process, for that matter, and we all know how it ended up. I don't have probably time for my footnote here, but it was about that from European perspective, Israel is a very good example of a failed state. And it's not probably what I wanted to bring in here was not about the opinion polls and the pattern of voting. It was very idea of the wall, in which Europe has a lot of experience with. Walls litter Europe all over, and all of them were breached. Wall is a synonym of failure. My 2 points about why the difference is not that big. And I will not challenge the point about there's a kinship. Yes, certainly there is a common values. But I think that more of explanation is needed here. And one part of it is simply that there is no Europe. Yes, and the point was made yesterday, European integration has advanced way beyond explanation in some areas, and it's lagging dramatically behind in others. And one of those who are lagging is common foreign and security policy. Every step there is so painful, is so difficult, it's really a tortured process. And essentially, most of the European states find the proposition that together they can make a big difference way less attractive than the idea that there is a small state which makes a big difference. And there is forever search for this magical option. Yes, we can, with our small resources applied properly, we can make a big difference. That will be our claim to the world fame. That's our visibility, that's our profile. The whole world will applaud us. And quite often the way to achieve this visibility and this profile is to join the United States, as we have seen in the Iraq crisis. Few of those who joined this coalition of unwilling really cared very much about terrorism or Iraq. It was much more about their own political profile, their own visibility, how to achieve it better, how to increase their weight inside Europe by joining the United States. Paradoxical thing, but generally enlargement increases this tendency very strongly. And the last point here is what Europe is really able to do as far as failed state is concerned. And, well, it is a fairly big and growing union of states. But the sad fact is that the resources available are not limited, but they are being reduced. Less and less Europe is really able to do. And we're not speaking only about the military might. That's a separate and very sad story. But also about political attention, also about economic resources available there. They are going down, all of them. And so in this sense, it's probably a point which goes against Steve's appeal for minimalist policy from the United States. It is a reasonable point. Minimalist policy has much better chance of achieving success. At the same time, this huge dominance the United States has, this unchallenged leadership, really drives against this minimalist approach. It really pushes towards being more ambitious because the dominance is so unquestionable. And from that point of view, if you are a failed state in desperate need of an aid, of an assistance, of an attention, Iraq is certainly a disaster because it attracts all the resources. But the failure in Europe to agree on its own constitution is also a setback, because Europe is becoming more and more self-centric. There are more and more issues to deal with inside. There is more and more need of distributing, shrinking resources inside there. Failed state cannot really hope for much. And I'll draw a thick bottom line here, taking a point with Kofi Annan of all people. Yesterday, he was quoted as saying in this very university that he hopes that in the foreseeable future, the issues that will dominate a political agenda will be big issues like global warming and pandemics and the depletion of resources and water scarcity. This sort of issue will come to the forefront. And he is probably right in a sense that this issue will achieve more prominence. But still, in practical terms, I think we'll be dealing mostly with the consequences of those, with civil wars and with violence and with state failure. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if this is the enviable or the unenviable position to be in, because who's going to remember what everybody said when I seek to summarize or disagree or agree? So when we think about what to do about failed states, there is a growing literature on conflict prevention and peacebuilding, which I'm going to suggest here 4 points. And one of them is that given the nature of the flows today, of everything crossing borders, there's a need for multi-layered authority and responsibility in the world. Recognizing that sovereignty has been breached, that sovereignty is a very complex issue. One has to think of governance at the global level, the regional level, the national level, and the local level. To do what? Well, to do things like pursue policies, outside-in strategies toward failed states, not inside-out, not to seek to go inside and turn them into models of Texas, but instead to offer at the structural and outside level peace-oriented adjustment policies. That is, if you look at adjustment policies that currently hold sway, they basically undermine safety nets, make it next to impossible to maintain security. That is social security for people in times of great turmoil and situations of increasing inequalities and periods of rapid transition. For example, debt forgiveness would be a big part of this, making debt forgiveness a big part of such peace-oriented adjustment policies. Another part of this would be in terms of elections, democratic elections, where candidates, if elections are going to be encouraged, and they should be encouraged, but encouraged in a fashion not immediately, but instead after a process of stability has taken place, that the elections would require that candidates gain not just majorities, but they also gain a particular percentage of each of the different regional or minority groups, which therefore encourages a politics that crosses ethnic barriers, crosses regional barriers, and creates a different and much more stabilizing form of electoral democracy, as opposed to one that increases the social insecurity. A third aspect of what one can read in the literature about conflict prevention and peacebuilding is the importance of disarmament, demobilization, of essentially moving in the direction of counter-proliferation rather than the current proliferation that we have from the very bottom to the very top in the area of weapons. that is, if we want to, one of the problems with the threat formulation on rogue states is, first of all, as the North Koreans have proven, it's almost an incentive to go ahead and try to get around and build weapons as a basis for a deterrent against those who have a strategy of preemption and a strategy of military supremacy. So I think basically we need to get back to a non-proliferation regime, a non-proliferation regime from top to bottom, and stop the flow of arms cross borders that simply exacerbate conflicts and undermine governance. The fourth and final point, is that there's been an effort throughout the 1990s to avoid what keeps coming up again and again, and is still there, and that is the need for a multilateral rapid deployment force to address issues where states are failing rapidly and heading toward collapse, and there simply is no trained and equipped troops available to reach those points of crises in a short matter of time. Consequently, it's a question of a coalition of the willing based upon whether national interests are triggered or not. So in one case, we get Rwanda, where there are no national interests that are triggered. On the other hand, we have Kosovo, which does become important, and then it gets attention. It's not neglected, but it also gets bombing of Belgrade, which is a bit of a crude instrument to deal with matters of protecting refugees in Kosovo. And in fact, the numbers spiked of the people who were killed in Kosovo by Serbian forces after the bombing. And it even took the OSCE Corps, the OSCE group, 1,000 OSCE troops on the ground had to be airlifted out before the bombing could begin. And they were making some progress on this issue before that happened. So when you look at those various points, to be able to address the issues of failed states, who is actually at the forefront? Who are the people that are, and where is the effort coming from to keep alive the rapid deployment force, to talk about non-proliferation, the issues of debt forgiveness, the concepts of multi-layered authority? Well, when you look at that issue, it's on the other side of the Atlantic, and it is among small states. As the rapid deployment force, in 1995, the idea came back on the agenda. It's been around for some time, 50 years or more, ever since the beginning of the United Nations, the importance of a multilateral rapid deployment force to deal with crisis situations. But Canada put it out in 1995. Also Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, and I believe Norway also have their own particular proposals for multilateral rapid deployment forces. And I think this comes from the different experience of Europe relative to the United States. It's true, we may have started on the same evolutionary line in terms of universalist values, but certainly there has been a history of evolution that's taken Europe and the United States in different directions, and I think the negative lesson of colonial occupation, in Europe's case, particularly France and North Africa, and the positive lesson of EU integration, such as it is with all of its halting problems moving forward, I think this has provided a set of lessons, both negative and positive, which make Europe much more amenable to uses of soft power and operating in a multilateral fashion, as opposed to our own historical experience and evolution in the United States, which is not homogeneous, but I mean we're currently riding on something that is a deeply embedded part of American political character, which is the messianic American exceptionalism theme, which the neocons have ridden into office. So I think for Europe, I think the challenge, and some various people brought this up here at the table, is to basically take the model that has been developed in Europe, both toward, in terms of foreign aid and in terms of approach to failed states, questions of development, as well as to their own internal dynamics moving toward integration, and to take that beyond Europe and to take that as a global model, one that should be expanded and not seen simply as a regional policy for Europe alone. And I think that's the difficulties, of course, would be doing that without further splintering the very fragile union that's been created, particularly in this period of expansion. But I believe the junior partnership role and the idea of kind of trying to soften the distinction between the two approaches right now is really the wrong way to go. It's important here, I think, in the United States, but it's of course a challenge here is how it is that we interpret, and that's of course a debate that needs to happen here, how it is that we interpret our increasing isolation in the world. Is the rest of the world wrong, or should we be taking a look at the policies we're projecting outward? Is that why we've dropped like a rock in the public opinion around the world? I think that for Europeans to be more assertive, will raise that issue and that debate here that needs to take place. So the challenge here, I think, in the United States is, well, number one, send the neocons packing, but also to move beyond a mere return to what the Bush administration was calling a la carte multilateralism. A la carte, Richard Haas's term in the State Department, that was used, they thought was very cute. That we'll be multilateral when we want to, and unilateral when we want, and we'll call it a la carte multilateralism, which doesn't look too cute these days at all when you consider that. I think the important thing is not to slip back into that position, which a second Bush administration could do, and even a Kerry administration, but instead to have a very, very strong, a debate about what multilateralism really entails. And secondly, very importantly, that the United States and Europe not just get caught up in a new multilateralism for multilateralism's sake, but multilateralism for what? What are we going to cooperate about and for? And I think here we have two distinct models that appeared out here at the table. One which would take us in the direction of Europe becoming part of a larger American agenda. Maybe it's this minimalist policy. And on the other side of that was a more pragmatic cosmopolitanism, a direction to go with this idea of the universal values. How do we project those universal values out there, given that those universal values, if we have these universal values? Through hard power, through that type of approach, or through a soft power approach, one which is far more pragmatic, and I would call it cosmopolitanism, but you could call it pragmatic internationalism if you like.
Thank you. I think as chairman, I heard agreement on the part of the panel and all of the last responses, so I think that is a very auspicious moment to conclude the proceedings. And I want to thank everybody involved in making this possible, the Council Generals and all of the participants who came from afar, and the Berkeley faculty who participated, and of course the audience. Thank you very much.